Well, first, because it's all of them at the same time. It is indeed a religious group and an NGO, as you said, a lobbying group, a pressure group. It's a political group in that sense, but it's also as a more kind of opaque and secretive side, or maybe we should use past tense here. It did have a opaque and secretive side. It had cadres within the state apparatus and the bureaucracy, but these are pretty much, these don't exist anymore in Turkey, so it's a more past tense thing. But so the movement is multifaceted, and all these are dimensions of the movement. But I don't think it is difficult to define the movement, because of all these I see no contradiction, and it is primarily a religious group. I mean, this is a religious group which conducts activities in various fields of life, in education, in business, in media, in interfaith dialogue, and also, as I've explained, in the political field as well. But the movement's legitimacy for its followers comes from religion. Gülen was a religious scholar. That's why he was. That's where his legitimacy came, his charisma came from, and the followers, members of the group, primarily are motivated by religious devotion, nothing else. This doesn't mean that they work also with non-religious groups. I mean, when they work in the field of NGO, in the field of education and other areas, they can cooperate with non-religious people or with Christians, Jews, because the movement also has a kind of a brand of interfaith dialogue, so it cooperates very well with other religious organizations. But the members of the movement, those who are followers of the movement, are religious Muslims, and mostly Turkish, but not necessarily, but they are all religious Muslims, and this is a religious movement basically. One reason also for the confusion is that the movement tries to undermine or downplay its religious credentials. It never comes up and says we are a Sunni Islamic group. It always points to its other activities, its education activities, its NGOs, interfaith dialogue, and etc. There are two reasons for this. One is the history of Turkish state and its kind of an oppressive attitude towards religious groups. So in order to escape that oppression, the movement never identified itself primarily as a religious group, but pointed to its other activities. And when it comes to its diaspora activities within the West, they don't want to carry the burden of kind of deep-rooted Islamophobia in these Western societies, so they don't present themselves as essentially a religious group, and they point out to, as I said again, other activities. So in the group's own presentation, religion never comes up as a primary element. But for me, as an outside observer, when I look at the movement, I see it as a primarily religious group and all other activities as side elements or secondary elements of this group. It's primarily a religious group. But this movement itself refrains from this formula, this presenting of itself, for the reasons that I've just mentioned. So that also leads to the confusion of how to define this group. Actually, they both represent distinct and kind of rival religious traditions in Turkey. Erdogan comes from the National View movement, which is Turkey's main Islamic political tradition. It comes from a legacy of several political parties dating back to 70s. In contrast, Gülen comes from a more social Islam originated movement. He was once a member of the Nurcu group, which is basically, I suppose, is a more bottom-up religious, to make society more religious, but not through politics and state, but from more bottom-up tradition. And they had very frosty relationships before 2000, these two traditions and groups. They clearly didn't like each other that much. It started to change in 2001, 2002, when Erdogan declared that he has gone through a process of political learning and he wants to be less confrontational and less radical in his political attitude. One of the bigger divisions before 2000 between these two groups was also about their geopolitical orientation. Gülenists were always openly pro-Western, whereas National View tradition was always very critical of the West, or one could say anti-Western. So in 2001, Erdogan moved towards what basically the Gülenists had been advocating for a long while. That basically not confronting the state apparatus and having better and more friendly relations with EU and United States. And so from that moment until, as you said, 2012-13, they had a 1 decade of alliance. It was a marriage of convenience for both sides. For Gülenists, Erdogan government provided a protective umbrella for their activities because they were always fearful of the intervention of Turkey's secularist generals and the military. So the government provided a protection for them. And for AK Party, Gülen movement was very useful for it provided basically cadres for them to rule the country, because no other group in Turkey, religious group in Turkey, can provide large amount of religious and well-educated staff to the government. This was basically what made the Gülenists unique among all other religious groups in Turkey. So I mentioned 3 dimensions. It has to be religious, so it comes from the same social base with AK Party. They are well educated, and there are, in terms of numbers, there is a large quantity of such individuals within the Gülen movement. So this also explains the hubris of the movement towards AK Party. They thought that they were indispensable. No one can replace them because no other religious group could provide such large amount of people for bureaucracy. This alliance went for a decade, as I said, but it seems, as we understand from now on, they really never trusted each other that much. I mean, they worked together in an alliance, but it was more of a marriage of convenience than a true friendship and alliance. There is an assumption that Gülenists are in a way a unique religious movement within Turkey. I don't agree with this. The followers of the movement promote this idea of uniqueness in order to promote themselves as different from all other groups and in a way superior to all other groups. That's kind of understandable. And rivals of the group are enemies of the group, to be more clear, underline its uniqueness in order to vilify the movement, in order to declare them as kind of an exceptionally villain group among Turkey's religious movements. I don't agree with neither characterization. Gülen movement follows the more mainstream traditional Sunni Islam that the huge majority of Turkey's Muslims belong to. In Turkey there is an Alevi minority that's between 15 to 20%. It's a more heterodox Islamic tradition. But if you leave that aside, the 80% of Turkey's Sunni groups follows there is a Sunni mainstream Islam, and Gülen movement subscribes to this mainstream like word by word. There is very few things that Gülen deviates from the mainstream understanding, and so there has been some selective modernization of this classical traditional Sunni Islam, but on clear issues where the traditional Islamic verdicts are unacceptable to modern people, Gülen had kind of found bridges to adapt it to the modernity, but this was never a systematic thing. So in terms of his religious teachings, he's a classic mainstream Sunni Islamic scholar. When you look at the practices of the movement, they have no practice other than any other Sunni Muslim in Turkey does. So the movement doesn't have a religious theology of itself. It doesn't have any original religious practices. So it's primarily a mainstream religious group. Then why it is considered so different from all others? I think this is the important question. I think for two reasons. First is the quantity. No other religious group has reached the mass following that Gülenists had reached, and no other group has reached the power and wealth that Gülenists had reached in 2000s. So this is what distinguishes Gülenists from the others. Second, not religiously, but I mentioned this in the first question as well. In the realm of politics, Gülenists are probably only religious group who is unabashedly pro-Western. So they do not criticize West. They refrain from getting verbal clashes or civilizational critiques of the West. They claim to be a bridge between West and Islam. So in that they are kind of unabashed. There are other religious groups who are not critical of the West for pragmatic reasons, but they never say it openly as Gülenists do. One dimension of this being pro-Western is also related to the interfaith dialogue that the movement has promoted so much. But again, interfaith dialogue is not something that Turkey's mainstream Sunni Islam would oppose. I mean, so the distinction is not theological, it's more political. So when the other groups wants to vilify the movement, they always call it as a CIA agent, a Western agent. So you see that there is nothing religious in the discussion. It's more of a political orientation. And when we talk about the relationship between Gülenists and other religious groups, it was never very good. For two reasons. One, as I said, Gülenists were much more successful and powerful than the others. And second, relatedly, this led to a kind of a hubris within the Gülenist movement, that they are so exceptional, they are so superior to other religious groups. They kind of despised them or considered them as not capable enough. And this led to a kind of a hubris and a hierarchy in the Gülenist mindset. This is another reason why they never had very good relationship with other religious groups. But after 2016, when Gülenists are declared a terrorist organization in Turkey, all other religious groups kind of aligned with the government to criticize and vilify the Gülen movement. But as I said, if you look at the substance of their critique, I think it is more of a political debate rather than any religious debate. It once used to be very popular because the characteristics of the movement that I have mentioned is a kind of a perfect recipe for the needs of the diaspora communities. They are pro-Western in their political orientation, but in their religious life they are very conservative. So subscribing to this movement allowed the diaspora to integrate but not to assimilate. If that's the kind of the golden formula for diaspora, they could live their religious lives in a very conservative way, actually, within this movement. But politically, they wouldn't be considered outcasts, or that's what the movement kind of promoted, which helped it enormous popularity among Turkish diaspora in Europe. But this changed after they break up with Erdogan, because Erdogan is also immensely popular amongst Turkish diaspora. And once the state has kind of crushed the Gülen movement, the diaspora is more attached to the state than anything else, the Turkish state. So they consider now Gülen is more of an enemy of Turkish state, so they become an outcast within the diaspora as well. They received a kind of an influx because Gülenists are now fleeing Turkey in large numbers to Europe. So they are creating a diaspora of their own, separate from the currently existing Turkish diaspora, which is mostly the current existing Turkish diaspora, which is mostly pro-Erdogan or secularist. Now a third diaspora is emerging, that's basically the Gülenists, religious but anti-Erdogan group. And these three diasporic communities remain separate from each other, and I think it will remain so as long as Erdogan is in power. The movement was in a state of crisis for almost a decade. Since Turkish state declared it a terrorist organization in 2016, there was immense pressure over the group, which also led to some internal debates, criticism, and those critics going all the way up to Gülen himself, who was also part of the attacks. Some of the attacks was also directed not only the leaders, other leaders of the movement, but Gülen himself. So there was kind of a disarray and struggle, internal struggle within the movement going on. Gülen's passing created a kind of a emotional situation where those fights would stop for a while. Those people who have distanced themselves from the movement will stick together once again. This feeling of we should unite and stick will prevail, but this will be a short-lived moment. I mean, right now we are observing that many people who were very critical of the group are once again kind of declaring their allegiance in a way. But this is an emotional mindset that I don't think will last very long. Once that emotional stage is over, I'm expecting fragmentation and decentralization. The movement can, it will take time until it's officially divided, but it will be more and more decentralized and fragmented, and different units in different countries will act more independently. Another question, I think, is how the Turkish state would react to Gülen's passing away. At the moment, this movement's followers, we never had a clear number, but not less than 500,000. I mean, in Turkey, since the coup attempt, 2 million people have been investigated by the courts. 500,000 people were detained at some point. So there is an enormous purge ongoing. And with Gülen's death, one might expect that that fight is over. I mean, Erdogan has won. It was already clear. But with Gülen's passing away, there is no need to continue the fight and kind of reintegrate these people into Turkish society. This is possible, but I'm not expecting Erdogan to pursue this strategy because he has always used Gülenists as a scapegoat for all the problems the country is facing. So he would try to stick with that. But once Erdogan's era is over and Gülen is already dead and the fight is ended with Erdogan's AK Parti's victory, there might come a point where state is less vindictive or less repressive of this group. Just a quick example of the state of repression in Turkey. Once Gülen died, 4 journalists are arrested in Turkey because when they gave the news, they said, "May God mercy him," which is a kind of a colloquial sentence you say after anyone dies. And because of they said that, these journalists are arrested. So this is the state of repression that's going on in Turkey. And Erdogan uses this state of repression to sustain his autocratic rule. With Gülen's passing away, it would be better if Turkish state would end up its persecution. But as I said, I think Erdogan would stick to that. But once also Erdogan goes, it would be a closure. Turkey needs a closure on this issue. Stopping this persecution and leaving these people on their own would be the wise strategy for Turkish state.